rolling?
Rolling.
We're rolling.
Snoring.
Snoring. So we have our producer, the D-Baby, says we're rolling. And our producer number 2, little Austin, who is now 6 weeks old, making his second appearance on the road to Paris. He's snoring through this one, so you guys do not get the treat of our second up-and-coming producer. This is the 6th episode of the road to Paris. This one is recapping the Ostrava Elite 16, one of the coolest venues in the entire sport. If you watch the finals, you heard Anders Moll just lavishing praise on the Czech Republic, the venue. It's in a retired steel mill, one of the coolest places to play beach volleyball. I was on the mic just for the first 2 days, which explains why I'm wearing a Boise State Broncos hat. Went out to Boise, Idaho for a little flight school with Chase Frischman, Troy Field, and Taylor Crabb. Awesome crowd out there in Boise. Fun to work with the campers. Chase is doing a lot of fun stuff. So before I got into the Olympic race, just wanted to give a huge shout out to Boise State, Idaho Beach, the whole nine. You guys were fantastic. Love seeing all these little pockets of beach volleyball fans, be it in Boise, Idaho, more than just a potato state, down to a retired steel mill in the Czech Republic. Now, in the Czech Republic, it was a huge weekend for the United States, and the biggest winner of the weekend has to go to my guys Andy Benesh and Miles Partain. If you missed our episode with Miles Partain, you can click on this link. If you're listening, you can't click on that link, but we had him on the podcast a couple weeks ago. It was phenomenal, our most listened to podcast of the year. They won a huge bronze medal in the Elite 16. Prior to Ostrava, we had 13 either Elite 16s or World Champs, so 12 Elite 16s plus World Champs. The American men had never won a medal. Miles Partain, Andy Benesh, they changed that. They came out of the qualifier, had no business making it out. If you guys did not watch their final round of the qualifier with Estonia's Martti Saar and Kusti Novak, please do. Craziest third set I've seen in my life. Miles and Andy take an 11-8 lead in the third set and then go down 14-11. A 6-0 run, and then somehow they tie it up at 14 apiece, survive a couple match points. Miles gets a float serve ace for the win. Craziest third set I've ever seen. High on the stress meter. End up qualifying. So they barely had any business qualifying. Then they hardly had any business breaking pool. They needed help from Germany's Nils Ehlers and Clemens Wickler to beat Chile's Grimald cousins, Marco and Esteban. They got that help, and then they beat an absolute murderer's row. They beat Bartosz Wojciak and Michael Brill of Poland, 21-19. Then they had the matchup that the world's long been waiting for. The Swedish jump setters, David Alman and Jonathan Helvig. The two most trailblazing styles in beach volleyball are Miles Partain and Andy Benesh in Sweden. It was a short-lived match. Andy and Miles won the first set, 21-18. They kind of controlled it, but then Helvig, it looked like he re-injured that right hand that kept him out of World Champs that ended up giving Triborn and Trevor Crabb the slot into World Champs last year. I don't know what the diagnosis is with Helvig, so I'm not going to speculate, but it looked like he injured that right hand again. Andy and Miles ended up getting a forfeit in that second set, moving into the semifinals, where they challenged Qatar, Cherif, and Ahmed, Tijan. More on them in a bit. Lost in 3, and then they beat Andre Perisic and David Schweiner, the home team that they got whacked by in pool play. Schweiner and Perisic had made 3 straight finals in Ostrava. They were coming off a gold medal in Uberlandia, and Miles and Andy absolutely handled them. The bronze medal match, Miles and Andy just looked like the better team. It was the first American men's medal in an Elite 16 since Volleyball World took over the tour. Huge for Miles and Andy. And now as far as the Olympic race go, they just have 3 finishes. So technically they're down in the Olympic race. They're just number 18 in the rankings, but their average point finish per event is 760 points. Triborn, I still mix that up. It's not Tri and Trevor anymore. It's Triborn and Cam Schock. They have the second highest average among the American men at 492 per event. Trevor Crabb and Theo Brunner have 484. I've been talking with Taylor Crabb, Theo Brunner, a bunch of guys about what we think the average finish you're going to need for your best 12 of the Olympic race. And we all figure that 600 points per event is probably going to be the number. So right now, Miles and Andy are at 760 per event, which is the equivalent of a 5th in an Elite 16. So they are in excellent shape. Finally got a medal for the American men in an Elite 16. And bigger than that is that's going to now put their entry points in a position where they should be in the main draw of Stade. So once you're in the main draw of those Elite 16s, you're sitting pretty because those qualifiers, as you can see from the teams who didn't make it out, like Georgian Andre, Sam Kodafava, and Paolo Nicolai, they are brutal. So huge bronze medal for Miles Partain and Andy Benesh. I'm going to keep going with the men. Second biggest winners of the weekend, Cherif Samba and Ahmed Tijan from Qatar. It's good to see them back on the world tour. When I was listening to the broadcast, Damien Schumann, phenomenal commentator, love listening to him and his Australian accent. It is just delightful. He was mentioning that there was some kind of injury to the Qataris, so we haven't seen them a ton this season. We saw them in Doha, and we saw them in Tepic, and that's it. They've just played 2 events so far this year, so it's been a couple months since we've seen them. They looked quite healthy. They ended up taking a silver medal. But again, just speaking to the depth of the Beach Pro Tour, they needed help to break pool play. They went just 1 and 2, squeaked out of pool, and then ended up running all the way to the gold medal match where they fell in a very, very well-played gold medal match too. Who else? Anders Mol and Christian Sorum, and their gold medal match vaulted them to right to where they belong. They are now the number 1 team in the Olympic rankings. As I mentioned, almost every time we do one of these Road to Paris, not going to talk a ton about Anders and Christian. Their play on the court speaks enough. They are now number 1 in the Olympic ranks. Sweden is number 2. The last big winner for the men, well, really not a big winner here, but just interesting storylines, is the Brazilian men's race is getting interesting. So I had Georgian Andre at the beginning of this Olympic qualification cycle. I had them qualifying no problem. But now they are not quite struggle bus, but with how fast these events turn over, where the entry points are based on your best 3 out of your last 4 finishes, their gold medal in Itapema seems eons ago. And it was really just a couple events ago, but George and Andre have struggled in Elite 16s. They didn't make it out of the qualifier in Tepic, didn't make it out of the qualifier again in Ostrava, didn't have a great event in Uberlandia, and so their points are still solid, and I'm not overly concerned about them, but I thought it would be George and Andre way ahead, and then it would be Evandro and Arthur battling it out with Renato Lima and Vitor Felipe. Renato and Vitor finally showing signs of life again. They beat George and Andre in the qualifier, ended up taking a 9th, so still not a great finish, but a decent one. They'd been struggling this season, little bit of a struggle bus for Renato and Vitor, and really they hadn't been great since taking that silver medal in last year's World Championships. They've got signs of life, as does Evandro and Arthur Mariano. Evandro and Arthur, young King Arthur is what I call him on the podcast. They've been playing fantastic. They won a gold medal in Saquarema, ended up coming out of the qualifier, qualifying again, whacking Chase Budinger and Miles Evans 21-10, 21-16, and then they beat Sam Kodafava and Paolo Nicolai. Still, in my mind, one of the top 5 teams in the world. They won a gold medal in Elite 16 Yermala last year, and now they're back in the qualifiers and not making it out. So Evandro and Arthur are playing some fantastic beach volleyball. Went to 3 with Qatar, ended up losing that one, but they're in good shape. So now that Brazilian men's race is really, it's very interesting. Far more interesting than I figured it would have been. As far as Pedro and Guto go, they've now played in 2 events. I'm not buying. I don't think that they are a long-term team for the Olympic race. Could very well be wrong. I'm wrong about things all the time. But once Guto's 5th place finish at last year's World Champs, once that washes out and they get back into the qualifiers for elites, which they're on track to do unless they get a very big finish soon, I don't think that that's a long-term solution. I think that Pedro, as good as he is, as phenomenal as he has been throughout the years, the decades really in this sport, I just don't think he has the endurance to sustain a full Olympic run. We have 12 months remaining in this Olympic race. So last Olympic quad ended in Ostrava. The schedule for 2024 is not yet out yet, but the Ostrava stop and Stad have remained on the same weekends every year, and so June 9th is the cutoff for the Olympic race in 2024. Ostrava should be the final stop. So a year from now, the Olympic race will be over. 12 months to go. The last 2 big stories for the men. The Dutch men's race is also getting very interesting because Alex Brouwer and Robbie Mewsen, they haven't gotten on the podium yet this season. They have taken a fifth, and they just took a 13th in Ostrava. And so that is likely going to put them back into the qualifier for Stade, potentially. I don't know for sure, but it's possible they're back in the qualifiers. And as we've seen, when you're in the qualifiers, anything can happen. Shit hits the fan. And so Alex Brouw and Robbie Musen, they're not as dominant in that Dutch race as I thought they might be. Stefan Bormans and Jork de Groot did not play in Ostrava. They are back on the entry list for the Jurmala Challenge later this month, and they are back on the entry list for the Stade Elite 16 in July. Then you have Matthew Immers and Steven van de Velde. They lost in the first round of the qualifier, which is big for the other Dutch teams. They lost to Maurits Pristals and Robin Seidel, who just can't seem to break through that last round of the qualifier. They're just knocking on the door. Then every time they seem to knock on that door, an American team closes them out. In Tepic, it was Triborn and Kame Schock who closed them out in a thrilling 3-set battle. In Ostrava, it was Trevor Crabb and Theo Brunner. Trevor called it a useless qualification because unless you break pool and make a good run in the Elite 16, the points just aren't good enough to really move you up in the entry, and the points aren't good enough where it's really going to be a useful finish in the Olympic race. Now, I think splitting $5,000, getting a main draw finish, getting those matches in, getting better points than Try and Kame did, I think that's more than useless, and especially it's not a useless tournament because they won that first Battle of the X's. I was talking with Adam Roberts about that every time a Battle of the X's happens, it always seems to be the guys who got dumped that win at least that first battle. And Trevor and Theo looked great. They kind of whacked them. It was 21-15, 21-16. Triborn and Kame Schock took their medicine, flew back home, and they will be back on the road again in the Jurmala Challenge. But Try and Kame are at least in the main draw of Jurmala, Trev and Theo, back in the challenge qualifiers. It is just a brutal grind of the next 12 months of this Olympic race. This system it's wild. I mean, there's so much turnover between qualification and main draw. But Trev and Theo, I think, had a big weekend. I think anytime you make a main draw in an Elite 16, whether or not you break pool, and they did not, they lost out on points. So it was Pedro and Guto who ended up moving on in that third spot. I still think it was a good weekend for Trev and Theo. Now, for the women, Terese Cannon and Sarah Sponcil, big silver medal. I mentioned that it had been 13 straight Elite 16 to World Champs that the men had not won a medal in an Elite 16. As for the American women, it's now 3 straight Elite 16 events that we have had a team in the finals. And speaking even more to that depth, it's been a different team every time. It was Kelly Chang and Sarah Hughes, then it was Kristen Nuss and Taryn Cloth, and now it is Terese Cannon and Sarah Sponcil coming out of the qualifier. They were the 6th seed in the qualifier, won 2 matches in a combined hour. They just swept their way straight through, ended up winning pool in kind of a weird mathematical victory over Anna Patricia and Duda. They both went 2-1 in pool play. And despite losing the head-to-head to Anna Patricia and Duda, it still comes down to points, where Sponcil and Terese ended up getting that edge on points, got a bye straight into the quarterfinals, made quick work of Joanna Mater and Anouk Vergier-Dupre, 21-16, 21-14, went into the semifinals, where they met, guess who? Another qualifier team, Melissa Humana Paredes. I try to add as many R's to her name as possible, both on the commentary and at the elites at the road to Paris. They beat Melissa Humana Paredes and Brandy Wilkerson in 3. Their second straight time beating the Canadians. They beat them in the Huntington Beach quarterfinals, ended up making a 3rd in Huntington Beach, and then in the finals had a very well-played match against Duda and Anna Patricia. Won the first set, ended up losing in 3. Big silver medal for Sponcil and Terese. They jumped up into number 5 in the Olympic race. So now the U.S. has the number 1, number 2, and number 5 team in the Olympic race. Number 3 is Duda and Anna Patricia. Number 4 is Australia's Taliku Clancy and Maria Faye Artacho. So they are staying on the road. They're going to be back in Jurmala, and then they will stay on the road through Stade. So it's a big Euro road trip for Sponcil and Terese, and what a heck of a start it is. That silver medal is massive, especially since Kelly Chang and Sarah Hughes and Kristen Nuss and Taryn Cloth both finished 5th, which are not bad finishes, but with how deep our American women's side is, that 600 points I mentioned, that should be the kind of average finish for the men that'll get you in. I think that is going to be a higher bar for our women just because it's so deep. We have 1, 2, and 5. It's remarkable depth from the Americans. Now, as for Mel and Brandy, that is their first international podium as a team. They have been a bit quiet on the Volleyball World Beach Pro Tour thus far this year. That's just their third event, their first podium. That's coming off. They've had a kind of a good but strange year. They won AVP Miami. It was Brandy's first AVP win. Big congrats to her. But then they took a 5th in New Orleans. They took a 5th in Huntington. They took a couple 5ths in Elite 16s, and now they finally got on the podium, and they looked phenomenal. Brandy led the tournament in aces. No, it was Mel who led the tournament in aces with 15. Terese Cannon had 14. Italian Valentina Gottardi, she also had 14. Brandy led the tournament in blocks with 28. Taryn Cloth had 26, and Terese had 24. So it's always a good thing when you have 2 American teams as 2 and 3 in blocks. But when you have your blocker leading the tournament in blocks and you have your defender leading the tournament in aces, in my mind, Mel and Brandy are the number 1 defensive team in the world, and they have the stats to prove it, and they're just getting better and better and better with every tournament. So they should be out of the qualifiers from here on out in Elite 16s. I think that is where they will stay. It was a logistical error from Mel and Brandy and the Canadian Federation that they didn't play in the Elite 16 in Uberlandia, and so that little gaffe has been shored up, and now they're moving forward. They'll be out of the qualifiers, and I think that they will, in due time, become a top 5 team in the world. Our last story for the American, not just the American women, but women in general, is kind of our North American report. Betsy Flint and Julia Scholes finally got that Elite 16 win. They broke pool, ended up taking a 9th, however. So it's a good finish. It's an improvement, but it's not where they want or need to be. So they're probably, entry points wise, going to slip back into the qualifiers. And so they're going to have to figure out, they're playing great in the United States. Their AVP finishes are fantastic. Still looking for those big finishes on the road. So they're going to have to find a way to get back on the podium, get back into that fight. Because right now, the biggest race that I'm keeping my eye on is that 4th spot for World Championships for the American women. Number 1, 2, and 3, I think, are pretty sealed up. Kelly Chang, Sarah Hughes, Kristen Nuss, Taryn Cloth, and now Terese Cannon and Sarah Sponcil. I think those 3 spots for world champs are pretty much shored up. That 4th spot is between Betsy and Julia, Savvy Simo and Tony Rodriguez, who fell in the 2nd round of the qualifier, and Emily Stockman and Megan Kraft, who fell in the 1st round of the qualifier. Now, it could potentially come down to the NORCECA World Championship qualification tournament. That is happening this weekend in Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic. Andy Benesh and Miles Partain, they are going for the men. They likely won't use that bid. Even if they do get it, it could just trickle down to the next NORCECA team. Kelly Kalinsky and Haley Harward are going for the women, and should they win their half of the tournament, the way it works is they split the NORCECA federations into 2 pools, and you have to finish in the top 2 of your side. And so for the men side, it is Canada, Cuba, and Mexico. Those are the big 3 on one side of the pool, and only 2 come out. And so it'll be between Cuba, Sam Schachter and Dan Deering of Canada, and Miguel Sarabia and Juan Virgin of Mexico. If Juan and Miguel lose, they'll still get a wild card into World Champs either way. So it's more, the pressure's more on Cuba and Canada to come into that top 2 spot. The other side is the U.S., Nicaragua, and Guatemala are really the only 3 competitive teams. So Andy Miles should win that, no problem. Don't know exactly how the pools break down for the women, but if Kelly and Haley, if they win that and we don't have 4 American women's teams qualify via points, that spot will then go to Kelly and Haley. They will get into World Champs. So that would be a big one for them. I don't think it'll trickle down to the NORCECA bid for the American women. I think it'll be between that points race. And with the way that Stockman and Kraft are playing overseas, they've had a lot of trouble so far. They lost in the 1st round. They're 0-3 now in Elite 16 qualifiers, and they are now being back into the challenge route. They're going to have to find a way to qualify for main draws and do it fast, because World Champs, the last qualification tournament to get into World Champs is the Hamburg Elite 16. That conflicts with Manhattan Beach, and so that will be a very, very important tournament. I wouldn't say, typically this is where we do a struggle bus segment. I don't know if anybody's really on the struggle bus at the moment, just because we've only had one event in the last month. George and Andre are probably as close as it gets. They're 0-2 now in Elite 16 qualifiers. I already touched on Stockman and Kraft. They're 0-3 in Elite 16 qualifiers. The Chase Budinger and Miles Evans, not really struggle bus either, but they lost quick in the qualifier to Evandro and Arthur. They dropped out of Stade, and so I'm not sure what their goals are in terms of international play, if they're going for the Olympics or if they're going for world champs or if they're just playing the events that aren't conflicting with AVPs, but they're going to play AVP Hermosa instead of going to Stade. Not sure what Try and Kame are going to do, not sure what Trev and Theo are going to do. They're both signed up for both, so we're going to see what happens there. The last aspect of the North American report is Sarah Pavin. So her and Sophie Bukovic, if you listen to our podcast with her, they split up. Sarah Pavin is now playing with young Molly McBain. She was a standout at Florida State. I think she has an excellent game, product of the NCAA pipeline, had obviously great coaching in Brooke Niles, Nick Lucena, and Jason Lockhead. Now Molly McBain and Sarah Pavin. I don't know if it's a long-term partnership or if it is just kind of a couple test events, but they are signed up for the Yermala Challenge. They are currently the number 6 seed in the qualifier. So Sarah Pavin is back on the World Tour. I don't know what direction Sophie Bukovic is going. So time will tell as far as that goes. That is it for the recap for Ostrava. Next upcoming is that World Championship Norseca qualifier. That is this weekend in the Dominican Republic. The weekend after that is the Yermala Challenge. So I will do another Road to Paris after that Norseca, and after Yermala, I'll do a combined episode after that. So June is a big month. We get 2 Road to Parises in June. Always fun hanging out with you guys on the Road to Paris. I feel like it's been a long time since we did a Road to Paris. I missed hanging out with you guys, just chatting Olympic beach volleyball. So I will catch you in a couple weeks after Yermala. Shoots.